Okay, hi everyone. This is the day 2 and 3 recording for History 265. I'm trying to share my screen and record myself in the screen at the same time, so please bear with me as I try to figure this out. Bit of music from China to start our class.
不会为了限量款排队，我都是天亮了才睡。时间比 LV 还贵，人生总苦短，又怎么能白费？没兴趣在乎我在别人眼中的定位，普通或另类，讨厌或敬佩，不需要多余的应对，只想跟懂我的说一声幸会。因为别人都谢，快乐是自己的，没人可以借。忘记了恨谁，有谁忘了谢？偶尔在情绪会泛滥的夜，没有人会帮你把你变得更好。错过只能怪你没够趁早，每天都要保持前进，我势必要有强劲的实力，才跟全新的自己问好。我知道他不会在，人和事要为我开始绕室外，该不该还没来的不想猜，有谁能真的看得清楚哪里是归宿？要怎么组未来的拼图？先走好每一步。昨天已经过去，明天还没来，今天的一切就算突然我也不奇怪。我不再预测未来，因为总在意料外，该在的都会在，不管这世界变得多么快。从没想过买个彩票可以让我中奖，也不需要不实在的面子，我也早就不跟别人谈论什么梦想，悄悄把梦想都变成了现实。不管我是试试看还是扑了空，直接做到，而不是挂在嘴边。是个穷光蛋还是大富翁，我都尽力的过好我的每天。因为当不会在，人和事要为我开始绕室外，该不该还没来的不想猜，有谁能真的看得清楚哪里是归宿？要怎么组未来的拼图？先走好每一步。知道的不会在，人和事要为我开始绕室外。
Slowly kind of fade this out and dive into our material. That was a piece from of Chinese hip hop there from a rapper named Johnny J. This is one of the few hip hop songs I can find that has a translation in the subtitles, so I find it kind of interesting to hear, of course, hip hop in languages around the world. I'll be sharing that with you over the course of the semester as much as I can. Kind of expanding your musical horizons as we cover this world history from the early medieval era to the early modern world. So for today's class, I tried recording this once already for Monday, but it didn't quite work out, so I'm trying this again. Just providing kind of a brief overview of material that we would cover if we were in person in class, which would involve much more discussion, but I'll have to push you to do that on the discussion forums on Blackboard for now, for this week at least, and expect an email from me as well with some more details about how to complete this material, even though we're having to meet remotely the second week of class. So on this opening slide, you see an image, of course, of the Great Wall of China. And the central question we're talking about today is, why does modern world history begin in China? And we'll cover that question in some detail, looking at many different examples as to why most historians, when looking at modern world history, will start with the history of ancient China, because it's kind of surprising given what we've studied and what most of you have probably learned coming into this classroom regarding world history. When you look at it with a clear-eyed view, thinking about this process between 1200 and 1800, it becomes really apparent that in many ways China was kind of ahead historically. And it's a really interesting example of imperial continuity across millennia. So, the Great Wall was continuously built from the 3rd century BCE through the 17th century CE on the northern border of the country as the great military defense project of successive Chinese empires, with a total length of more than 20,000 kilometers. The Great Wall begins in the east at Shanghuaiguan in Hebei province and ends in Jiayuanguan in Gansu province to the west. I hope I haven't butchered those names too badly. Its main body consists of walls, horse tracks, watchtowers, and shelters on the wall, and includes fortresses and passes along the wall. Um, the wall itself reflects collision and exchanges between agricultural civilizations and nomadic civilizations in ancient China. It provides significant physical evidence of the far-sighted political strategic thinking and mighty military and national defense forces of central empires in ancient China, and is an outstanding example of the superb military architecture, technology, and art of ancient China. It embodies unparalleled significance as the national symbol for safeguarding the security of the country and its people. Of course, a fortress wall like this made sense perhaps in the 3rd century BCE, just as great Roman walls did at the height of the Roman Empire. And as we'll see over the course of the semester, however, this would prove to be in some ways ineffective when we get to the invasion of the Mongols in the early medieval era, and their time actually controlling the Chinese Empire. So it was not fully effective at preventing an invasion of nomadic or semi-nomadic people, as we'll see. And yet it is a testament to Chinese, I think, architecture, engineering ingenuity, and longevity in many ways at the same time. So before we dive into this material and to answer this question as to why we consider modern world history to have its beginning in China, in many ways in ancient China, we should kind of step back and think about global populations in the present moment. I think this helps us kind of think from the present moment much further back. So although most of us are pretty well versed in U.S. history, maybe even the history of the Americas, including Canada and Latin America to an extent, maybe even to a certain extent European history, if I had to bet, I would guess most of you are not as familiar with East Asian history. And that's something that surprised me when, as a graduate student, I realized how little I knew myself about East Asian history. And I kind of feel like I've been catching up ever since. But it's strange because of the fact that most humans born on Earth today are more likely to be born in China than anywhere else when you think about the numbers, right? So the current population of China is 1.409 billion. In contrast, the current population of the U.S. is just over 340.1 million. So following China, again, at 1.4 billion, comes India at 1.45 billion. That's actually more than China. And then the entire continent of Africa is 1.55 billion people. And the entire continent of Europe is 744.3 million people. So this shows that the world's population historically has been centered and remains in India and China, even though we don't give these regions as much attention in our study of history in the U.S. as I think these numbers call for. So beyond that, if I go to the next slide here. This central question, why does modern world history begin in Asia? As most historians agree, questions of statecraft, such as the role of morality and foreign policy, the balance of power, questions of when to use force and when to appease, and of appropriate military strategy when force is the option chosen, were debated by Chinese analysts throughout much of the Zhou dynasty, which dates back to 1122 BCE and lasted until 221 BCE. So that already gives us a sense of just how long this tradition of diplomacy and questions of statecraft and government have been around in China longer than anywhere else in the world. This means that the Chinese were debating topics that we associate with Europe, questions of statecraft, right, and questions regarding global trade or long-distance trade, while Europe was still populated with Neolithic scavengers, right, long before there were major sedentary civilizations and even the development of unique languages and cultures in European history, as far as we know, the Chinese were debating these really advanced topics. So this period from around 2000 BCE to 221 BCE are considered the formative years of Chinese history, or the Sendai, meaning three dynasties, the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou. The Chinese did not expand into empty space, but rather by force into territories already occupied by peoples with similar languages. Like all the world's empires, the Chinese Empire was built on conquest, on the subjugation of militarily inferior groups, really through violence and military expansion, whom the Chinese portrayed in some cases as subhuman to justify their conduct and their expansion. The Xia were the first to organize a political entity that might be considered a state. That is, it had a clear socio-hierarchical structure and a clear hierarchy of command beyond that as well. The eastern neighbors of the Xia, the Zhang, defeated the Xia in the mid-15th century BCE, and there is evidence of a written language emerging in this era as well. This is evidence of an early recorded history dating back to the 15th century BCE. And as we'll see, this act of recording one's imperial or collective history of a culture group is something that we associate with early modernization in many ways, but also with how a universal kind of instinct among humanity to record a collective history as a central component of collective identity, right? So one's identity is rooted in its history, of course. So by the 18th century, in the Common Era, China held about 25 to 40% of the entire world's population. And again, today, China and India make about 36% of the world's population, in a part of the world that is not as much of a landmass as you might think. So we'll move ahead to the next slide here. So by the late 10th century, so beginning about the 4th century BCE, ancient texts described Chinese society as divided into four classes: the scholar elite, the landowners and farmers, the craftsmen and artisans, and the merchants and tradesmen. Under imperial rule, the scholarly elite, whose exemplar was Kongfuzi, whom we call in the West Confucius, directed the moral education of the people. The farmers produced food, the craftsmen made things that were useful, and the merchants promoted luxury goods. Because in theory the Confucian elite advocated simple rural values as opposed to a taste for luxury, which they viewed as superfluous, leading to moral degradation, the merchants who sold for profit, adding nothing of value to society as they saw it, ranked low on the social scale. Although in reality economic success had its obvious advantages, it is interesting that this philosophy of virtue really reigned dominant throughout the era that was dominated by Confucius in particular. And that dates back to the 4th century, right? So there was already this notion that a lust for material goods was an empty pursuit, right? And that pursuit of knowledge was a more virtuous and valuable pursuit, a more valuable way to spend one's time. I think there's something we can learn from that in the present day. So on the present slide that you see behind my bubble figure is a long timeline of Chinese history and the successive dynasties. You can see, of course, this dates back 1.7 million years ago. And we've covered the first few of these in the Sendai period, if I can zoom in here. And you see the Xia and the Western Zhou and the Jin dynasties. But if I go over here, I wanted to zoom in also in particular on the Tang dynasty. So beginning in the late 10th century in the early northern Song, the government bureaucracy was staffed entirely by so-called scholar officials chosen through a civil examination system. The highest degree, the Zhenshi, or presented scholar, is the direct translation into English, was awarded as the culmination of a three-stage process. The examinations produced 200 to 300 Jinshi candidates each year. By the late 18th century, China's population had grown to about 300 million. The more than 1,200 counties, divided into 18 provinces, were governed through an imperial bureaucracy of only 3,000 to 4,000 ranked degree-holding officials. The officials ruled the land with the help of local gentry and locally recruited government clerks. Because the governmental structure was so thinly spread, it was heavily invested in the Confucian virtue ethic as the binding social force, and when that failed, in the use of harsh punishment for maintaining stability and order. So what this tells us ultimately is this clear system of scholar officials was a generally merit-based system, right, that drew from a massive pool of contenders, right, of talent, and those who could succeed in these written exams would rise the ranks, which shows kind of a really early merit-based system. That doesn't mean that there wasn't that there was a complete absence of potential corruption or nepotism, but it did show that people had to prove their own merit, right? So I also mentioned I was zooming in here on the Tang Dynasty, which ruled from 618 to 907 CE. The Tang Dynasty developed a form of government, a successful form of government and administration based on the brief Sui model, a brief interluding period of the dynasty, and stimulated a cultural and artistic flowering that amounted to a golden age. The heyday of the Tang was an era of extraordinary culture exchange, and China was at the center of it, both giving and receiving. So there was much cultural, economic, political, and military movement outside of China at this time. And this is a really key point and a dominant theme that we're going to see over the course of the whole semester. The fact that we tend to look at these cultures and empires in isolation historically, but especially with the Chinese Empire and its successive dynasties, and in particular the Tang Dynasty, we see that cultural exchange and commercial exchange and trade with distant cultures and empires really benefited this empire. And there's a lesson we'll take from this as we continue reading about the Silk Roads for next Monday's class, and we come back ready to talk about those trade routes that connected East Asia and China with the Mediterranean world and even Europe. So these different civilizations, even dating back to the pre-Roman era, and dating back some 3 centuries BCE, there was a great deal of cultural contact that historians are continuing to uncover and learn more about. And we see a lot of crossover and connections between distant cultures that we used to think were completely isolated from each other. So in the Tang Dynasty, I think, is a great example of these intercultural connections that traversed thousands of miles. So Koreans, Japanese, Tibetans, various Mongol and Turkic peoples, Southeast Asians, especially Malays, Indians, Persians, and Arabs were interacting with the Chinese and sometimes with each other, in particular along the Silk Roads, as we'll see. Sometimes their activities were threatening, often they were enriching, but all added to the complex mosaic that constituted the international system of East Asia. The Tang faced 2 classic problems of international relations. First, great and rich as China was, it was an attractive source of plunder to its neighbors. They were constantly raided and sometimes conquered by forces hostile to China. Tang China could never be secure. Its borders were too extensive. Chinese defenders invariably spread too thin. This led to this classic dilemma of how much of the empire's resources could be committed to defense and how much could be committed to maintaining a happy populace and keeping people happy while continuing to expand. Of course, this is a dilemma we tend to associate with the Roman Empire and its expansion and overextension, And we'll see this come up in other historic examples over the course of the semester. But it's interesting to think that this had already affected China as well, in the Tang Dynasty in the 9th century. So a couple other examples I wanted to get to today. And of course, I have a lot. If we were meeting in person, we'd be working a good bit on this exercise of Kung Fuzi, which I hope will also get a bit of a laugh. But I'll be sending an email out asking you all to divide up into small groups, so you can work on this in small groups outside of class as part of this first couple of weeks of class that we're not meeting in person. And ask you to choose a couple aphorisms that you find valuable or relevant from the list that was included in our textbook, and I have that linked here as well. And then I was going to ask you to compare that to a scholarly book that I've also posted on Blackboard, which I have here, The Analects of Confucius, translated by James Legge, and push you to kind of think about how these popular aphorisms might be questionable in some cases, right, from a historical perspective, and how they differ from those translations by a leading scholar in the field, who analyzes and translates these teachings of Kong Fuzi, as he was known in ancient China, in ways that still make sense but maybe aren't quite as catchy. So something to consider as you read and compare these two different sources of the same historical figure who, of course, shaped in many ways modern Chinese philosophy, from the ancient era to the present day, where his influence is continually felt, right? So on the second to last slide, third to last slide, I have a summary of Zhang He's voyages. This was a Chinese explorer who led 7 great voyages on behalf of the Chinese emperor in the 15th century. The voyages traveled through the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, and along the coast of Africa, as you can see, kind of tracing it along this map. His 7 total voyages were diplomatic, military, and trading ventures, and lasted from 1405 to 1433. Most historians tend to agree that their main purpose was to promote the glory of the Ming Dynasty in China, especially by displaying such a massive ship, and kind of display and show off Chinese wealth, opulence, in order to gain more trading partners, but also to extend this tributary trade system in which they would offer gifts in exchange for trading rights with these distant port cities and different civilizations throughout the China Sea and Indian Ocean. And it's worth noting here, right, when I was reading about this, I was pretty shocked to see that Zhang He's flagship was much larger than European ships around the same era, right? So this was one of Columbus's ships, the Santa Maria, that sailed across the Atlantic in 1492, just some 87 years after Zhang He's flagship made its travels throughout Southeast Asia and really displayed the dominance of Chinese history and culture and military to that part of the world. So again, kind of going back to my earlier points, I think when we look at these histories in comparison, you can see why it's a major disservice to focus on European history and the history of the Americas and Africa without also taking into account the history of East Asia, and in particular the history of China. So these are the last questions I wanted you all to consider for today, which I think we've answered pretty clearly for the most part. Aside from this question of inventions, I think I might have brushed over that. So back to this first slide. I forgot to mention that some of the major technological inventions that contributed to world trade and globalization, as some scholars would call it, in the early globalization through the Silk Roads and subsequently through in the Age of Exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries. Some sought-after items from Europe were these: the compass, gunpowder, mechanical clocks, and movable type printing, which was invented dating back to the 10th century in China. And we'll see later in the semester the 15th century invention of the Gutenberg printing press in Central Europe, in Germany, came again centuries later, although it was adapted to a really different writing system, a different an alphabetic system as opposed to a logographic system, which explains kind of the different processes that we don't want to get too hung up in comparing, saying one was more advanced than the other, but it's interesting to think about what gets left out when we only focus on one part of the world, right? So we will watch a documentary later in the semester in which we look at the history of paper making, both in Africa and in the Mediterranean, and then in China as well. And we talked a good bit about their complex system of professional civil service. So that is a pretty good summary of these key points. When we meet in person next week, we'll answer questions 4 and 5 and have a much more robust discussion about these two questions. Of who was Confucius or Confucius, and what legacy did he leave for China? And finally, why do you think the teachings, or his teachings, were such a powerful influence on Chinese society? And then we'll take some time to think about his actual teachings, some of the tenets of Confucianism that persist, how they compare to other major world religions, and also how, like a game of telephone, some of them have been maybe misconstrued and misinterpreted and mistranslated over the centuries, right, since their inception. So thank you all for your patience with our difficult situation in the second week of classes, and I hope you're doing well. I look forward to seeing you all in person once again, finally, hopefully next Monday. Take care, and be sure to feel free to reach out to me with any questions via email. I'll be available. Hasta luego. See you.